He did not remember what first caused the seed of doubt to sprout in his chest, but Joffrey Baratheon, though calling himself that was an act of faith in the rumor that he was Robert's son, found himself on the cusp of his 16th name day, harboring the faintest suspicion that perhaps his mother and grandfather were not the unassailable pillars of power he had assumed them to be. It was a small flicker of an idea at first, no more than a child's passing curiosity, sparked on a night he was so vexed by the tedium of his own court that he wandered out onto the Red Keep's walls to lose himself in the swirl of the city. He peered down at King's Landing under moonlight, the flicker of 1,000 candles and lanterns revealing a city that could become a living beast in a moment's notice. For once in his short life, the crossbow slung across his back felt heavy, less a symbol of fear and more a childish toy, empty and pointless. Joffrey had believed power was something worn like a crown, brandished like a blade. His entire upbringing taught him that to be feared was the pinnacle of rule. But as he gazed upon the dark sprawl of the slums below, he had a creeping feeling that fear could be a hollow foundation, especially when there was a man behind him who commanded more fear than he ever could. Tywin Lannister loomed always, sharp as any blade, a presence that overshadowed everything. And though Joffrey was king, any wise man understood who truly pulled the strings. He could not ignore the little humiliations, the way Tywin dismissed him with a single curt look, the way men obeyed Tywin's instructions more quickly than his, and the way his mother insisted that he abide by his grandfather's will when it came to ruling. That restlessness grew, day by day, fed by the subtle humiliations and the memory of a man, a father, he never truly knew. Cersei had insisted Robert Baratheon was his father. Joffrey tried to imagine what Robert would do if he could witness a Lannister overshadowing the realm's rightful king. Would the old warrior king have stood for this? So that was how, quietly, Joffrey resolved to do something about it. At first, he did not know what, but the bold and brazen nature of youth, combined with the cunning he'd taken from the Lannister side of his blood, convinced him there could be only one path. If Tywin Lannister was the truest seat of power, then to claim his own rightful authority, Joffrey must destroy him. His mother, Cersei, was blind with ambition and pride. She would never dream her beloved son might turn on her own father. Tyrion, the imp, might have guessed if they had been on kinder terms. But Joffrey had always looked on Tyrion with scornful eyes, never allowing the man's wit to guide him. And so no one, not a single soul in the Red Keep, suspected that Joffrey Baratheon was plotting something beyond an idle cruelty or a malicious jape. He was not known for subtlety or restraint, after all, only for the glint of sadism that lit his green eyes whenever he ordered a tongue cut out or a head parted from its shoulders. But hidden behind that petty brutality was an anger that burned deeper. If he was to be king, truly king, he needed the respect of the realm and an alliance that would remove Tywin's hold on the Iron Throne. The name that sprang to mind was madness at first, or so he thought. Robb Stark, the king in the north, the young wolf. The same youth who had humiliated the Lannister armies on the battlefield, who had captured Jaime Lannister. The dire wolf at the gates. How could they ever be allies after the execution of Ned Stark? In the half-lit gloom of his bedchamber, Joffrey paced back and forth with that question gnawing at him. The memory of Island Payne swinging the greatsword still made him smirk, but a sliver of uncertainty twisted in him as well. Was that the moment he began losing any chance of commanding men's loyalty? After all, his first act as king had been the killing of an honorable man. His mother and grandfather had urged it, but they left the decision, and thus the blame, at his feet. Yet, perhaps the death of Ned Stark did not foreclose all possibilities. Vengeance was a heady force, and if Stark's son had carved a swath of blood and conquest across the Riverlands, it was because House Stark had lost its patriarch. But men could be persuaded if offered the right prize. Peace in the north, the rightful head of a father's slayer, or perhaps some arrangement that let him keep the Riverlands unbloodied. Joffrey did not think like a seasoned statesman. He was driven by simple logic. If Robb Stark was the only man that Tywin Lannister had not been able to best with ease, then Robb Stark was the ideal ally. Even Joffrey knew he could not simply write a letter and expect the king in the north to come marching south for a cordial alliance. No, these were delicate matters. He needed someone to speak for him, but Tyrion was not to be trusted. nor was Varys, nor Littlefinger. They all had their games. Perhaps, ironically, the Hound was his only true resource, the unflinchingly blunt man who seemed indifferent to the politics around him, who cared only for protecting Joffrey's skin and sneering at the illusions of chivalry. But sending the Hound north alone would be too conspicuous. Joffrey needed a plan that spanned months, if not years, in the making. He laid the foundation slyly, learning from the very man he hated, Tywin Lannister. Tywin's relentless quest to bleed the North into submission had never come to fruition. After the capture of Jaime, Tywin had grown more ruthless, but also more frustrated. Joffrey, looking on from behind his mask of petulance, recognized that the first step was to appear feckless. He raged at court, demanded unnecessary executions, played the role of the reckless boy king so well that even Cersei occasionally took him aside and chided him for excess. Everyone dismissed him as a savage child. That was good. That let him watch. That let him plan. In secret, Joffrey wrote a letter, but not one of empty words. He penned each line with unexpected care, working late into the night. The letter was addressed to Robb Stark himself, though he took the precaution of forging a second letter addressed to the Lady Catelyn Tully. He needed them both to sense his sincerity. He proposed a parley. He expressed regret, hollow though it was, for the way Ned Stark had died. He blamed Tywin's manipulations, claimed he was left with no choice, that the Lannisters had forced his hand and threatened to kill him if he disobeyed. It was a twisted half-truth, peppered with enough hints of familial conflict that might tempt someone as honorable as a Stark. And it ended with a proposition. Join me, and together we can rid the realm of Tywin Lannister's iron fist. I will give you Jaime Lannister's head if you desire it. In exchange, you will help me secure my throne. He sealed those letters under the hidden watch of the Kingsguard who attended him that night, Ser Boros, a thick-headed brute easily manipulated with the promise of gold. Ser Boros carried them out, disguised among routine missives to be delivered by ravens to the corners of the realm. Cersei was none the wiser. Tywin never suspected a thing. The war raged on outside the walls, and they likely assumed Joffrey had no interest beyond the immediate gratification of punishing traitors. But ravens are fickle. There was always the chance the letters would not reach their intended recipients, or that if they did, Robb Stark would laugh and burn them unread. Yet, the message did find its way north, and it made its path to Riverrun, where Robb Stark and his bannermen were regrouping after the latest skirmishes. The king in the north read the letter privately. He was incredulous at first, furious. He nearly tore it to pieces. But his mother's cooler mind held him back from discarding it altogether. Catelyn Stark, battered by grief and loss, recognized the words were likely the manipulations of a cunning boy or his advisors. But she also recognized that if there was the faintest truth to Joffrey's claim, if the Lannisters were divided, it might be the single leverage they needed to topple Tywin. Tywin Lannister was the real power behind the Iron Throne. The letters claimed Joffrey understood that. And if that was true, how might the realm be changed if the young king turned on his grandfather? If the Lannisters were undone by their own scion, what doors would that open? So mother and son debated, quietly, in the halls of Riverrun, while the great Jon, Roose Bolton, Edmure Tully, and others demanded to know the reason for their closed-door council. Robb Stark, every inch the honorable young man his father had raised, struggled with the notion of making any alliance with the butcher of Ned Stark. But war is a crucible for necessity over principle. The North was bleeding. Its men fought valiantly, yet Tywin's wealth and influence stretched across the continent. And if House Tyrell joined with the Lannisters, the victory that had once seemed so certain might slip away. In the end, necessity prevailed over honor. Robb had grown into a shrewder king than many gave him credit for. He sent a raven of his own under dire secrecy with a single line, "I will consider your offer." That was enough. It was enough to spark the next step in Joffrey's plan. The boy king felt an unsteady jolt of triumph when, 2 weeks later at dawn, he found the reply lying inconspicuously on the edge of his bed. That had to be the work of Varys or perhaps Littlefinger. Someone had known of the letters. But oddly, the reply was placed there without any indication of who delivered it. Only the content remained. The king in the north was open to hearing more. As months ground forward, clandestine messages continued to trickle between King's Landing and Riverrun. They negotiated terms that seemed at once unthinkable and yet tantalizing. Joffrey was forced to make grand promises. Full pardon for the Starks. Recognition of the North's right to self-govern, with certain conditions. Political marriages to bind the two houses. Even a vow to deliver Tywin Lannister into the king in the North's hands, alive if possible. In exchange, Robb Stark would send secret envoys, small squads of loyal men who could slip into the city undetected, waiting for the day when Joffrey needed them most. They would help dethrone Tywin, remove the hated Lannister hold on the capital, and ensure Robb Stark had vengeance for his father's death. It all sounded impossible, yet war had made stranger alliances. More cunning still was the method of Joffrey's approach. He spun a dramatic tale that Tywin had orchestrated Ned Stark's death in such a way that left Joffrey with no recourse. The letter was replete with pitiable allusions of Joffrey's heartbreak and terror at his grandfather's iron grip. Robert was not always kind, he wrote in a particularly melodramatic passage, but he was still my father in name. I never wished to see another father parted from his children. Not truly. Robb, reading the letter by a sputtering torch, found himself wanting to spit at the page, but some part of him, the part that was not wholly the honorable Ned Stark but also the desperate war commander, recognized the advantage. Even a liar might serve a purpose. Beneath all these negotiations, danger simmered in the capital. Tywin Lannister did not become the fearsome lord of Casterly Rock by ignoring omens. He felt the tension in King's Landing. Joffrey's outbursts had quieted, replaced by an unsettling watchfulness. He questioned men in the Red Keep's corridors about shipments of arms, movement of gold cloaks, the coming and going of ravens. Servants, who once cowered at the king's petulant demands, noticed that his rages were fewer, and that he seemed more cunning. Tywin's suspicion narrowed, and he began, in his own subtle way, investigating his grandson. He pressed Qyburn, who was studying new methods of interrogation, to keep an eye on the messages leaving the castle. He tasked ravens of his own to watch the roads from King's Landing to Riverrun. Then came the day that Joffrey learned Tywin was planning to ride north with a large host, an attempt to break Robb Stark's growing threat permanently. That news arrived by none other than Cersei, who let it slip over dinner. She believed it would please her son that Tywin was determined to bring back the head of the young wolf. Little did she know that this threatened everything Joffrey had worked to arrange. If Tywin marched with a considerable force, Robb could be crushed, or at the very least battered so severely that an alliance would be moot. Joffrey knew time was running short, so he played a cunning gambit. Gathering every ounce of the Lannister cunning that ran in his veins, he contrived to isolate his grandfather in the Red Keep's audience chamber. The king feigned a piteous apology for his earlier reckless behaviors, an act that made Tywin's lip curl in distaste. "I want to learn from you, grandfather," Joffrey said. "I know I have disappointed you, but perhaps you can show me how to be the king the realm needs." Tywin, blinded by his own arrogance, allowed himself to believe that Joffrey was indeed ceding more authority to him. He lectured the boy about taxes, about how to extract gold from the Crownlands and the Stormlands. As the lecture dragged on, the chamber emptied of curious onlookers until only the two remained, along with a pair of gold-cloaked guards stationed near the door. Joffrey made sure it was so. Then he delivered a carefully scripted speech about how the small folk in King's Landing were restless, how there were rumors of plague in Flea Bottom, how the gold cloaks needed more coin to keep the peace, and he asked Tywin to remain in King's Landing a few more fortnights to ensure stability before setting out. To Joffrey's private relief, Tywin agreed, albeit reluctantly. The old lion would see to the capital's accounts, restore order, then ride forth to finish the war. That was the time Joffrey needed. He was not yet ready to strike, not until the men from Robb Stark had infiltrated the city and were hidden in the labyrinthine alleys near the Mud Gate. The delay he bought might not be long, but it could suffice. The infiltration began weeks later. The first wave was small, a handful of nondescript men from the north, each one traveling alone, some disguised as mercenaries, others as traveling blacksmiths or peddlers of fur. They slipped into the city with little fanfare, taking up lodging in the cheap inns by the docks or in the warrens of the slums. Joffrey had arranged for them to receive small sums of coin from hidden sources, enough to survive. Over time, the scattered men assembled into small cells, each unaware of the precise identity of the others, for the king in the north was no fool. He did not want his entire infiltration undone by one incompetent or traitorous soul. In the Red Keep, Joffrey feigned ignorance and continued to play the part of the impulsive boy who took delight in petty cruelties. He had a man flogged for singing an insulting ballad. He spat insults at his uncle Tyrion. He demanded lavish feasts, bored the court with his every whim, and made sure Tywin saw nothing but the same spoilt child. Meanwhile, Robb Stark read every Raven's report from his hidden watchers in King's Landing. The infiltration proceeded slowly, methodically. The city was a tinderbox. 1,000 sparks could set it alight. They needed to wait for the perfect moment. That moment arrived one humid afternoon when Tywin decided he had delayed too long. He announced at court that he would ride north in 3 days. His host was ready, the wagons supplied, and though King's Landing had not entirely quieted, it would never be free of unrest. Joffrey's heart thundered. He would lose his chance if Tywin departed the city with the Lannister host. Once Tywin was gone, his own hold over the crown would be tenuous at best. Robb might still be persuaded to continue the alliance, but the entire plan hinged on capturing or killing Tywin in King's Landing itself, delivering a blow that would not only break Lannister power but also demonstrate Joffrey's real control. So Joffrey called for a feast. He claimed it was in Tywin's honor, a final tribute to his grandfather's valor before setting out for war. Of course, Tywin accepted. Cersei was radiant with pride. The entire court bustled with preparations for the lavish affair. Suckling pig, boar, spiced wines, lemon cakes, quail stuffed with onions and chestnuts. No expense was spared. Musicians were hired from bravos, jugglers and fools thronged the courtyard, and the great hall was decked in Lannister crimson banners that draped from the high rafters. The day came blazing hot, the sun scalding the stone ramparts, as the lords and ladies of King's Landing assembled to celebrate House Lannister's upcoming triumph. Joffrey sat on the Iron Throne, resplendent in crimson and gold. The hound stood behind him, silent and impassive. Beside him, Cersei glowed with a smug satisfaction, while Margaery Tyrell, Joffrey's intended queen, observed quietly, a tight smile on her face. Tywin stood below the dais, receiving well wishes and toasts. Next to him was Kevan Lannister, along with various courtiers eager to curry favor. The atmosphere was thick with perfumes and the stench of overcooked meats. Music began to play, harps blending with pipes, and Joffrey welcomed the assembled guests. He spoke in a voice that was not entirely boyish anymore, a voice that had begun to deepen. He uttered the usual Lannister propaganda, praising Tywin for protecting the realm and promising victory over the rebels in the north. Courtiers cheered and raised their cups. The feast commenced in earnest. As the first courses were served, the bards performed a bawdy tune, and Joffrey even pretended to laugh. The crowd was lulled by the show, lulled by the wine and the spectacle. But behind the mask of festivity, Joffrey was counting on a single moment of chaos. He had arranged with Robb Stark's infiltrators, through cryptic messages delivered by cutpurses and urchins, that they would light a small fire in Flea Bottom to draw out the city watch. At the same time, another group would cause a disturbance at the Lion's Gate, distracting the Gold Cloaks stationed there. The infiltration would then converge around the Red Keep's outer perimeter, waiting for Joffrey's sign. It would be a single arrow shot from the ramparts above the yard, an arrow with black feathers that soared into the night sky. That arrow would mean the moment was upon them. Yet Joffrey's plan risked everything. If even one part failed, if the Gold Cloaks remained at full strength near the keep, or if Tywin grew suspicious and left the feast early, the entire coup would collapse. Inside his chest, his heart hammered, but outwardly he wore a smirk, occasionally lashing out with a few cruel words at passing servants to maintain appearances. The sun dipped low, the sky gilded with dusk, and torchlight flickered along the feasting tables. The day's heat lingered like a choking blanket, and sweat beaded on the lords' foreheads. Wine flowed. Joffrey made sure that Tywin was served his own special vintage, a new cask said to be from the arbor, but in truth carefully provided by men loyal to the secret cause. When the commotion finally came, it was sudden. A breathless steward burst into the hall, stammering about a fire in Flea Bottom. He pleaded for more men to help quell the riot. At once, Kevin Lannister and some of the City Watch captains hurried out, while Tywin's face darkened with annoyance. He was just rising to inquire further when a second messenger rushed in, babbling about the Lion's Gate being beset by a mob. Shouts echoed. From outside, the guests shifted uneasily. Joffrey stood, calling for calm, calling for men to protect his grandfather. But even as he did so, a figure raced along the ramparts above the courtyard, bow in hand. In the torchlight, a single black-feathered arrow streaked upward, arching into the sky, a signal unnoticed by most but not by those who had waited for it, hearts pounding. They acted at once. From hidden corners in the castle yard, from the stables and the postern gates, cloaked men emerged, Northmen who had hidden themselves among the castle staff or the menagerie of performers. They fell upon the unsuspecting gold cloaks with savage efficiency, blades flashing in the torchlight. Chaos erupted. The great hall filled with shrieks as some of the watchers outside the main doors burst in, grappling with Lannister guards. Tywin Lannister, startled into an instant of inaction, found himself flanked by two of these infiltrators, their steel bared. He pulled a dagger from his belt, furious. The hall exploded into a whirlwind, lords and ladies trampling each other, guards pushing forward. The King's Guard rushed to protect Joffrey, uncertain of what was happening. Cersei screamed for her father, while Marjorie Tyrell clung to her grandmother in terror. Tyrion, somewhere in the throng, cursed and ducked behind overturned chairs. Joffrey descended the dais. The Hound shadowed him, sword at the ready. The infiltrators parted enough to let the boy king approach his grandfather. Their eyes gleamed with the savage satisfaction of men who had yearned for vengeance. Tywin recognized them now for what they were, stark bannermen in Lannister territory, in the very heart of the Red Keep. He glared at his grandson, breath hissing through his teeth. "What is the meaning of this?" "This is me claiming my birthright," Joffrey said, voice cracking slightly despite his attempt to sound regal. "You taught me that a king must be strong, grandfather." Tywin started to speak, but one of the infiltrators cut him off with a blow to the back of the knee, forcing him to kneel. In that moment, the hall was a storm of steel and screams. Some Lannister guards fought valiantly, but the infiltration was well planned and the gold cloaks were scattered around the city. The King's Landing crowd was disoriented, unsure who was friend or foe. Cersei rushed forward, half-crazed. "Joffrey, you cannot. This is your grandfather." She tried to grab her son's arm, but he shoved her away. Her eyes widened, horror-stricken, as she saw the hate and determination in Joffrey's face. "Don't touch me," he snarled. For years she had manipulated him, and now her hold was broken in an instant. She stood there, trembling, not knowing if she should wail or fight. Tywin Lannister, forced to one knee, stared up at Joffrey. His voice was low, furious. "Boy, do you think the Lannister name will die with me? You will have the entire West on your head." Joffrey's mouth twisted into a sneer. He pulled his crossbow from behind him, the same crossbow that had once been a symbol of his childish cruelty. Now it was the instrument of a boy's vengeance. He aimed it at Tywin's chest. "I'll deal with them as I please, but first, I'll deal with you." A hush fell over the great hall in that moment, as though the swirling chaos outside had paused to let them hear the last words. Tywin looked at his grandson with a mixture of disbelief and disdain. "You are no king," he said, voice cold. Joffrey fired. The crossbow bolt struck Tywin in the breast, lodging in the rich doublet that bore the golden lion's sigil. The old lion let out a strangled sound, surprise mingling with the agony. He pitched forward onto the marble floor, one hand scrabbling at the shaft protruding from his chest, bright blood-staining gold thread. The world lurched. Cersei screamed, a raw animal cry. Kevan Lannister, returning from the courtyard with a handful of men, saw his brother falling and roared in fury. Then the storm truly broke. Kevan's men charged, but the Hound and the infiltrators fell upon them. Swords clashed in the candlelit hall. Lords and ladies cowered beneath tables, shrieking. Joffrey stood over Tywin, crossbow in hand, watching the life ebb from the man who had controlled him for so long. For a moment, a fleeting pang of fear raced through him as he realized that, by his own hands, he was crossing a threshold from which there was no return. The realm would never be the same. But beneath that fear was an exhilaration, the heady rush of a boy stepping into the shoes of kings far older and shrewder than he. Tywin's eyes fluttered, struggling to focus on Joffrey. Perhaps he tried to speak, but the blood in his mouth turned his final words into a guttural rasp. Joffrey, face pale, fired again. The second bolt struck Tywin's throat. The old lion's body jerked, then went still, the lion's eyes wide open, the last breath rattling. And just like that, House Lannister lost its patriarch, the pillar on which its entire might had rested. Outside, the city was in uproar. Flea Bottom burned in places, the Gold Cloaks battled unseen foes, and as news spread that Tywin Lannister had fallen in the Red Keep, confusion and panic seized the streets. Some suspected a northern invasion, others thought it was a peasant revolt. In truth, it was Joffrey's plan executed with brutal precision. The immediate hours after Tywin's death were a blur of violence. Kevan Lannister was cut down by the Hound's sword before he could retaliate. A handful of Lannister loyalists tried to form a defensive ring around Cersei and the dais. The fighting ended only when the infiltration secured the Great Hall, and the King's Landing guards who had not fled rallied to the banner Joffrey still carried. In the end, Joffrey was the last Baratheon by name, and also the last recognized Lannister power in the city. Cersei had been dragged away, screaming, by the men loyal to her son. She would be given a chamber in Maegor's Holdfast, locked away until Joffrey decided her fate. Margaery Tyrell, pale as bone, was whisked back to her quarters, a captive in all but name. The Tyrells, once allies to the Lannisters, were left reeling by the sudden betrayal. By dawn, the Red Keep stood under the direct control of Joffrey's new guard. A mixture of Northmen in disguise, the Hound, and a scattering of Crown loyalists who, stunned by Tywin's death, latched onto the only authority left. Small folk outside the castle gates woke to find the city in chaos. The remains of riots simmered, smoke billowed from a block in Flea Bottom, and whispers of the old lion's death spread like wildfire. Some believed it was Tyrion's doing, others said it was Pycelle's, others pinned it on foreigners. But within hours, every tavern and alley was abuzz that Joffrey Baratheon, the boy king, had turned on his grandfather. On the third day after Tywin's death, as the city smoldered with tension, the gates to King's Landing opened for a new arrival. Robb Stark rode in at the head of a modest entourage, accompanied by Grey Wind stalking at his side. It was not an army. He had left the bulk of his forces in the Riverlands, but it was enough men to protect his person. The streets parted for him in wary silence. He wore the trappings of a king of winter, fur cloak despite the southern heat. His face was set like stone, uncertain. At his side rode Catelyn Stark, looking drawn, eyes flicking from one sign of destruction to the next. They did not parade. They moved quietly, escorted by Joffrey's newly loyal city watch. They entered the Red Keep's yard where Joffrey waited, flanked by the Hound and a column of men. Robb's supporters tensed, unsure how the confrontation would proceed. But Joffrey greeted Robb Stark with a short nod, gesturing to the castle that had belonged to the Targaryens, Baratheons, and Lannisters in turn. "Welcome," Joffrey said, forcing himself to keep his voice steady, devoid of the shrillness that once marked his every command. Robb Stark dismounted, his gray eyes flicking over Joffrey, measuring him. The memory of Ned's death lay between them like a blade. If Robb had been less controlled, he might have attempted to cut Joffrey down on the spot. But there was too much at stake. The entire realm quivered on the brink of a power shift that could plunge it into deeper war or open a door to peace. For a long, charged moment, neither young king spoke. Then Robb said, "The man who killed my father stands before me. You called me here as an ally." Joffrey swallowed, painfully aware of how close the dire wolf loomed. "I told you the truth in my letters," he said, voice carrying across the courtyard. "I was but a pawn. Tywin orchestrated that execution to demonstrate his power over me. And now Tywin is dead by my own hand, as I promised. His head is yours if you want it." A breathless hush. Robb's eyes flickered down to see a large object at Joffrey's feet, covered in coarse cloth. The tension in the yard was palpable as Joffrey nodded for a guard to pull back the cloth, revealing Tywin's severed head, a golden lion pinned to the brow in a macabre final insult. No one missed the dried streaks of blood or the lifeless expression on the face that had once commanded the West. Robb Stark was no sadist, but the sight of Tywin's head gave him some grim satisfaction. He then looked back at Joffrey. "You vow that was your only role in my father's death? That you were forced into it?" His voice was tight, skeptical. Joffrey's lips curled in an awkward attempt at humility. "By the time I was placed on that throne, I had no real power to spare your father. Had I disobeyed my mother and grandfather, I would have been killed or removed. I was not the king then, but I am now." Silence stretched again until Robb nodded once. It was not a forgiveness, but an acknowledgement that the truth was complicated. The mother of the young wolf, Catelyn Stark, remained on her horse, face grave. She spoke then, her voice resonating with sorrow. "King Joffrey, you have delivered the head of your own blood. My son stands here having lost his father. If there is to be peace between the North and the Iron Throne, we must have more than just the blood of the guilty." Joffrey drew a breath. "I offer the North its freedoms. I will not press your lands with war or taxes beyond what is fair for the realm. I will confirm your right to rule the North as king, if that is your wish. We can rule as equals, sharing the realm in peace, just as we have shared a common enemy in Tywin Lannister." It was a remarkable concession, and one that caused more than a few uneasy looks among the onlookers. But they had come too far. Robb nodded curtly. "If that is your oath, I accept it. We will see to the details in the days to come. And if you keep your word, we will not raise our swords against the Iron Throne." The realm did not become peaceful overnight. Far from it. The Tyrells in Highgarden, upon hearing of Tywin's death, initially threatened to march on King's Landing to avenge the Lannisters, but Margaery Tyrell was inside the Red Keep, effectively hostage. Joffrey was shrewd enough not to harm his betrothed, for he needed the breadbasket of the Reach to keep King's Landing fed. Instead, he offered them continued alliance, though on different terms. Olenna Tyrell seethed, uncertain if the new boy king could be controlled as easily as the old lion. But she recognized that war might devour Highgarden as easily as it did the West if she moved rashly. Back in the Westerlands, the blow to House Lannister was calamitous. With Tywin and Kevan dead, leadership fell to distant cousins or to Tyrion, who had never been beloved by his own family. Lannisport, Casterly Rock, the entire domain reeled, uncertain whether to stand by Joffrey or name another champion. Some proposed supporting Tommen Baratheon, Joffrey's younger brother, as a figurehead, but Joffrey held Tommen in King's Landing as well, and with Tywin gone, Tommen would be a powerless puppet. Joffrey, ironically, was the last real link to Lannister power in the capital. Amid this turmoil, Robb Stark returned to the Riverlands to reorganize his forces, secure his lines, and begin the formal negotiation of a new peace with the Iron Throne. He was hailed by many of his bannermen as the avenger of Ned Stark, though it had been Joffrey's hand that ultimately ended Tywin. Some even whispered that the boy king had redeemed himself by turning on the traitorous Lannisters. Others spat at the mention of Joffrey's name, refusing to forget or forgive Ned's fate. Robb was caught between the old wounds of betrayal and the pragmatic demands of the future. In King's Landing, Joffrey governed with an iron grip, but an iron grip tempered by fear. His partnership with the North had come at a cost, and the city was still simmering with unrest. He found that the tasks of true kingship, balancing the finances, preventing starvation, dealing with the Tyrells, the Martells, and the lingering threat from the Westerlands, was more difficult than he ever imagined. More than once, he found himself wanting to lash out, to kill a disobedient lord or a complaining commoner. But a small voice in his head reminded him that kingship, real kingship, was not about petty cruelty, nor could it be sustained by terror alone. That was the lesson Tywin had taught him unwittingly. Fear might win battles, but it would not build a stable realm. So Joffrey sought counsel from unexpected places, sometimes from Pycelle, other times from Littlefinger or Varys. He disliked them all, mistrusting their serpentine tongues. But more than once, he realized his own ignorance and forced himself to listen. He also found himself in tentative talks with Tyrion, who had survived the coup by happenstance. Tyrion hated his father Tywin, but that did not mean he suddenly loved Joffrey. Still, he recognized an opportunity. With Tywin gone, the Lannister name might endure only if Tyrion supported his nephew on the throne. In a quiet audience chamber, they spoke for the first time with civility. Tyrion had once slapped Joffrey. Joffrey had nearly killed Tyrion on the Blackwater if the notion had struck him. But now, with the future uncertain, they approached each other with caution. Tyrion had a keen mind for the city's finances and the subtle negotiations with the Tyrells. Joffrey grudgingly acknowledged he needed that mind. In the midst of these changes, a solitary raven arrived from the north. It carried tidings that Winterfell, once burned and abandoned, was now being rebuilt under Rickon Stark, the boy who had returned from savage exile with Osha. The war with the Ironborn had turned in favor of the mainland forces after the Ironborn's hold on the north began to waver. The letter ended with a simple note from Robb. "The North stands free and willing to work with you if you uphold your vow." Joffrey read it alone in the small council chamber, feeling a twinge of annoyance at the mention of the vow. Yet he understood that, from now on, his rule would be shaped by whether he kept his word or not. If he betrayed the North, they would come again with fire and steel, and this time there would be no second chance. The next few moons were a balancing act. Joffrey consolidated power in the capital, carefully placing men loyal to him in positions once held by Lannisters from the west. He reorganized the Gold Cloaks, appointing new officers. He managed to quell an uprising from impoverished smallfolk in Flea Bottom by lowering the price of bread, though that required him to negotiate with the Tyrells for more grain shipments. The Red Keep's dungeons filled with Lannister loyalists who had refused to bend the knee to the new order. Some were executed to send a message. Others were spared to avoid further inflaming the West. Meanwhile, Robb Stark navigated the complexities of returning to the North as a conqueror of sorts. He had to reassure his own lords that he had not sold his honor by making an accord with the man who beheaded Ned Stark. He traveled to Winterfell, oversaw repairs, and hosted emissaries from Joffrey's court who came bearing gifts and offers of trade. The outraged voices within Robb's ranks began to soften as the benefits of peace became tangible. The Riverlands were to be restored, no more Lannister armies burning their crops. The road between King's Landing and the Trident opened again for merchants. Gold started to flow once more, and the wounded realm began to heal. Yet old grudges smoldered. Even as Robb sought to unify the North, a rumor spread that the Freys, furious over the loss of a potential royal alliance, might be plotting revenge for the broken betrothal to one of Walder Frey's daughters. The Karstarks, still bitter over the death of their lord at Lannister hands, questioned if any arrangement with the Iron Throne could be trusted. Robb found he had to walk a delicate line, ensuring his own bannermen that the memory of Ned Stark's execution was not forgiven, only set aside for the greater good of the North. Back in King's Landing, Joffrey faced a rebellious shadow from the west. A nephew of Tywin Lannister, named Daemon Lannister, declared he would not recognize Joffrey as rightful king, calling him a kinslayer and a monster. He began rallying minor lords in the Westerlands to break from the Iron Throne. Soon, gold shipments from the mines of Casterly Rock slowed. Joffrey found his coffers draining dangerously. He needed to act or the royal treasury would bleed out. After all, Tywin's cunning management had once kept the crown afloat, but now there was no one to guarantee the Iron Bank or keep the gold flowing. Joffrey turned to Tyrion. In a tense council session, the two hammered out a plan to pacify the Westerlands. They would dispatch an envoy, promising leniency and a partial autonomy. They would confirm Tyrion as the official warden of the West, an unprecedented appointment given Tyrion's dwarfed stature and the scorn heaped upon him by many of his kin. Yet he was a true-born Lannister male, and none could deny that. Joffrey reasoned that with Tyrion in charge, the Westerlands might be brought to heel without open warfare. Tyrion agreed, perhaps out of a complicated mix of ambition and the desire to see the land of his birth not torn asunder. He rode west with a company of loyal men, bearing the crown's seal. The rest of the realm watched in a stunned hush as the War of the Five Kings, now overshadowed by the abrupt shift in King's Landing, lost much of its heat. Stannis Baratheon still clung to Dragonstone, proclaiming himself the rightful king and naming Joffrey a bastard. But with Tywin's death and the alliance between the North and the Iron Throne, Stannis' prospects seemed bleaker by the day. The Tyrells had no appetite to back Stannis. The Martells watched from Dorne, calculating their next move, uncertain if vengeance for Elia Martell might be found in the newly weakened Lannisters, or if they could leverage a new arrangement. Balon Greyjoy's ambitions in the north had faltered, and he retreated to the Iron Islands, unsure if he should continue a hopeless war or strike a deal with Robb Stark. In the capital, Joffrey discovered the uneasy burden of wearing the crown without Tywin's overshadowing presence. He found that issuing orders was easy, but making those orders serve the realm was far harder. The small council became a battleground of competing agendas. Littlefinger wanted to expand trade routes, promising new streams of coin. Varys whispered of dangerous rumors, secret plots, once-lost Targaryen heirs perhaps lurking in Essos. Pycelle droned on about the importance of the Citadel. And all the while, Joffrey realized that if he wanted his rule to last, he needed at least some measure of genuine illegitimacy beyond fear. One day, Sansa Stark, who had been relegated to a corner of the court, overshadowed by the memory of her father's death, came before him. She asked quietly for permission to leave King's Landing and join her family in the north. Once, Joffrey would have refused, perhaps tormenting her for sport. But now, older and haunted by everything he had done, he found himself unexpectedly granting her request. He gave her safe passage in a formal declaration sealed with the royal sigil, ensuring no harm would befall her on the road. He did not know why he did this, perhaps a flicker of guilt, or perhaps a desire to build a fragile bridge of goodwill. Sansa departed the city shortly thereafter, escorted by a retinue of northerners who had lingered since Robb's infiltration. A hush spread through the court at the Boy King's decision. Some called it weakness, others a cunning act of magnanimity. As the moons turned to seasons, the realm settled into an uneasy peace. Robb Stark ruled the north, rebuilding Winterfell, forging alliances with the Riverlands. Joffrey Baratheon, the king in King's Landing, battled daily with the complexities of sustaining a fractured monarchy, reliant on the Tyrells' resources, the Westerlands' gold, and the North's uneasy friendship. The two kings wrote letters to each other, more formal now, discussing trade routes, the boundaries of the North's autonomy, and how to handle the matter of the Ironborn. Their messages were terse but polite. Neither liked the other, but they both realized that this arrangement was better than the chaos of open war. Yet the realm was not fully at rest. From Dragonstone, the grim shadow of Stannis Baratheon remained. Rumors spread that he was amassing a fleet, that the priestess he followed promised him a fiery destiny. In the west, Tyrion found partial success in gaining the allegiance of some houses, but others continued to resent Joffrey's regicide. Bands of rebel knights haunted the hills, occasionally raiding caravans. In the Riverlands, bandits who once fought under the Lannister banners now turned to mere brigandage. Winter was coming, as the Starks loved to say, and the realm, still wounded from the War of the Five Kings, might not endure a harsh season without strong leadership. Joffrey, in his bedchamber one night, studied a map of Westeros lit by a single candle. He could hear the distant hush of the Blackwater rush flowing past the city. He felt tired, more tired than any boy his age should feel. He remembered the moment he loosed the crossbow bolt that ended Tywin's life. It replayed in his nightmares. He had freed himself from the old lion's grip, but he had lost something intangible in the process. Perhaps it was innocence, though any innocence he ever had was questionable. Or perhaps it was the knowledge that he had committed the ultimate sin, kinslaying, and the gods would not easily forgive him. He whispered to the darkness, "I did what I had to." And in the silent gloom, there was no answer. In the north, Robb Stark walked the cold battlements of Winterfell, gazing at the rising walls under reconstruction, hearing the voices of builders echo in the courtyard. He remembered the father he lost, the vengeance he had sworn, and the bizarre alliance he had made with the very boy who had announced Ned Stark's death in that vile spectacle. His direwolf, Grey Wind, prowled at his side. Peace was a fragile thing, he knew. Winter's snows would come, the White Walkers, if the old stories carried any truth, might stir beyond the wall. He was king in the north, but a king who had bent to necessity. He wondered if his father, had he lived, would have followed the same path of uneasy compromise, or if Ned Stark would have demanded vengeance even if it meant the entire realm burned. But the North had bled enough, and for now the war was ended, albeit on strange terms. Across the realm, lords tested the new balance. Some found profit in renewed trade, others stewed in their dissatisfaction, especially in the West, where the Lannister name seemed tarnished by betrayal and death. In the small council, Joffrey's new advisors planned a grand announcement. A royal tour of the southern and eastern provinces, where Joffrey would present himself as a benefactor, distributing boons to the small folk. He would pose as a king who had rid the realm of Tywin's tyranny. Rumors of the plan excited some, alarmed others. When day broke, Joffrey stepped out onto the walls of the Red Keep to greet the sunrise. The city below was stirring, black smoke drifting from the patch of ruins in Flea Bottom, still recovering from the orchestrated fire. Seagulls circled above the harbor. He breathed in the salt air. For years, he had believed cruelty was the essence of power. Now, he was discovering that power came not from cruelty alone, but from cunning, alliances, the hearts of the people. He still had the capacity for cruelty. That would never leave him, but he had learned to sheath it, to use it only when it served him. He recalled a line from one of those private talks with Tyrion. Power resides where men believe it resides. It was an odd sort of wisdom, but perhaps that was the new truth Joffrey had to live by. The realm seemed poised on a threshold. One misstep, one betrayal, and it would plummet back into full-scale war. The Martells were still an untested element. The Vale, under Littlefinger's manipulations with young Lord Robert Arryn, remained quiet but unpredictable. The Watchers from beyond the sea told tales of dragons stirring once again in Essos. But for the moment, the War of the Five Kings had been utterly transformed by a single stroke of betrayal, the lion's cub turning on the lion himself, forging an alliance with the wolf. At times, Joffrey entertained the notion of inviting Robb Stark to King's Landing for a grand feast, if only to show the people that the days of blood were behind them. But he imagined the tension that would fill the Great Hall, the memory of Ned Stark's fate overshadowing everything. Instead, he contented himself with forging the realm's new shape from afar. He insisted that official decrees refer to Robb as the King in the North, acknowledging a separate but allied kingdom. He gave the same courtesy to the Riverlands, naming Edmure Tully as an independent Lord Paramount who was loyal to the North first. This fracturing of the once united Seven Kingdoms was a bold break from tradition, but Joffrey did it to keep the peace. Each new step left the old houses reeling, and so the unstoppable Tywin Lannister was gone, cast down by the very scion many had dismissed as a vicious, spoiled child. Joffrey's name now inspired fear and uncertainty, for who knew how long he would maintain his uneasy pact with the North, or what new ambition would seize him tomorrow. The story told in taverns across Westeros was one of a war so intense that no corner of the land was left untouched, and how the young wolf and the boy king struck a deal to end the dominance of House Lannister. Some said it was the beginning of a new era of multiple kings in Westeros, fracturing the realm's unity. Others swore that, before long, one would betray the other, and the rivers would run red once more. In the quiet corridors of the Red Keep, Joffrey began searching for new ways to secure his hold. He reached out to the Faith, seeking the High Septon's endorsement. He offered gold and privileges to the city's guilds. He even authorized a portion of the crown's funds to repair damage in the city, a step that would have shocked the boy he once was. All of it was in pursuit of a kind of legitimacy that fear alone could not provide. Yet every time he laid his head down to rest, he was haunted by the memory of crossbow bolts slamming into Tywin's chest, by Cersei's screams, by the sudden hush of the hall as the old lion's blood pooled on the floor. For Robb Stark, the memory of that day was no less grim. He had not personally seen Tywin fall, but the day he rode into King's Landing and found Tywin's head waiting for him was forever etched in his mind. It was vengeance, yet it felt hollow. Ned Stark was still gone, and the grief that consumed him in the early days of war had not vanished. He wrote to Joffrey from time to time in a formal, stiff manner, discussing the boundary disputes that had arisen near Moat Cailin or the trade caravans to the Vale. Each letter was a reminder that his father's killer was now, bizarrely, his ally. The land slowly stitched itself back together. The Tyrells resumed sending grain. The North re-established trade in lumber, furs, and precious metals. The king on the Iron Throne lowered certain taxes on northern merchants, fulfilling part of his bargain. Gradually, men returned to the fields. The riverlands, scarred and battered, began to see new crops planted. The roads remained dangerous, but less so with each moon's passing. Then came the day that the first snows began to fall in the north, a herald that winter's arrival was close. Robb Stark stood in Winterfell's Godswood under the Heart Tree, watching the pale flakes drift onto the dark water of the pool. He felt a strange peace, albeit tinted with sorrow. He had defended the north, he had gained vengeance for Ned in a twisted way, and now a precarious calm reigned. But what cost? The north was free, but not truly separate from the rest of Westeros. Alliances bound them. If Joffrey turned traitor, or if another power rose, the north might have to fight once more. And he wondered if the souls lost in the war, Ned Stark, countless Northmen, lords, and small folk, would have found solace in this outcome. Far to the south, in the gilded halls of the Red Keep, Joffrey Baratheon was fitted for new robes of state. He had chosen a stylized lion's head motif, but tempered it by including the stag sigil and, interestingly, a small direwolf cameo clasp to acknowledge the North's role in the realm. His mother was not there to protest. She languished in a comfortable captivity, half deranged by the knowledge of what her son had done. Tyrion was on his way back from the Westerlands with news of partial success and partial rebellion. Marjorie Tyrell wandered the castle gardens, poised in a polite arrangement that served more as a truce than a real marriage. The courtiers whispered that the king was as fickle as wildfire, dangerous, unstoppable, always ready to burn. But for now, the realm was not on fire. Every day, Joffrey received new reports, new petitions. The small folk who petitioned him sometimes returned, astonished, claiming he was not as cruel as rumored. Others left the court in tears, having witnessed him sentence criminals to savage punishments. He had not banished his brutality entirely. It lingered in the corners of his eyes, the harsh twist of his mouth when displeased. But he used it with a cunning that Tywin might have admired had he lived. Months turned to a year, and the uneasy peace held, though tension ran beneath it like cracks in ice. Stannis on Dragonstone, the Iron Islands resentful, the Tyrells cautious and proud, the Martells still thirsting for a chance to avenge Elia. And overshadowing all, the uncertain alliance between the Iron Throne and the North, an alliance sealed with Tywin's blood. In that year, Robb Stark and Joffrey Baratheon managed to hold the realm together by their unlikely compact. When spring nights grew warm, the taverns of King's Landing came alive with rumors that the king in the north might ride south again for some grand council. But he did not. Letters continued to flow, and for the time being, that sufficed. The realm found a semblance of stability, if not true unity, and the War of the Five Kings was remembered as a storm that ended in a bizarre twist. Joffrey's crossbow bolt appending the Lannister stranglehold, forging an alliance that allowed two young rulers, once mortal enemies, to divide power between them. And so it was that on a crisp morning, with the sky clear and the gulls calling, Joffrey stood at the harbor, watching a ship from the north arrive. It bore the direwolf banner. From its deck stepped a pair of northern lords, Boltons, whose cunning glinted in their eyes, though they wore polite masks. They had come to treat with the king over some matter of territory near the neck. Joffrey forced a welcoming smile, suppressing his revulsion at their rumored cruelty. But cruelty was no stranger to him, and so they were, in a twisted sense, kindred. They walked together up the quay, exchanging formalities. When Joffrey retired that night, he found himself wondering how long such alliances could last, when men on both sides had so much blood on their hands. He gazed at his reflection in the polished steel of his crossbow. He no longer took the same sadistic joy in the weapon. Too many memories, too many ghosts. Yet it remained a symbol of power, a reminder of the day he had broken his chains by forging a bond with a wolf and plunging a bolt into the lion's heart. With that single act, the boy king had reshaped the War of the Five Kings, though whether for better or worse was a question that still hung over the realm. In the north, Robb Stark looked south with wary eyes, uncertain if the wolf and the lion stag could remain in harmony for long. The north was free, but its future was tied to a man who had once presided over his father's death. If ever that bond snapped, the land might drown in blood again. But for now, with winter creeping closer each day, the king in the north counted his blessings. The Lannisters had been humbled, the north was recovering, and for the first time since Ned Stark's beheading, the horrors of war seemed to recede. Perhaps time could heal some wounds. Across all the 7 kingdoms, a battered people tried to pick up the pieces of their lives. Villages rebuilt, lords reasserted old claims. The families of the dead mourned. Children grew up hearing tales of the War of the Five Kings, of how the young King Joffrey turned on his own grandfather. Bards sang songs of betrayal and cunning, but they also sang about the forging of an unlikely peace, hammered out on the anvil of war. At twilight, Joffrey sometimes stood in the Red Keep's highest tower, staring out over the city he ruled, listening to the hush of waves against the Blackwater Bay. He would remember that night on the walls when he was just a frustrated boy, unsure if he was truly a king or merely a puppet. A strange smile would shape his lips, because he was king now, without question. He had learned the darkest lesson of power. To rule, one must be willing to break the unbreakable, to spill the blood of those who stand in the way, even if they share your name. Perhaps that was a curse laid upon him by the gods. But it was also the key that unlocked his throne. And he wondered if the wolf in the north pondered the same truths in the silence of Winterfell's halls. Did Robb Stark reflect on the price of vengeance, of alliances with a man who had once shown him no mercy? The realm might never know. The histories would record only that, in the final reckoning of the War of the Five Kings, the unthinkable happened. Joffrey Baratheon allied with Robb Stark. Some claimed it was the beginning of a fractured peace. Others claimed it was the first step toward a new, more terrible conflict. For now, though, the battered land of Westeros had a fragile reprieve. The new lines on the map, the new boundaries of rule, the new alliances, these would define a generation. In the taverns, men lifted their cups to toast an end to war, or to curse the name of the Kinslayer king. In the far north, the winds of winter howled, indifferent to the intrigues of mortal men. But in the hearts of those who survived, in the uneasy silence of a kingdom caught between memory and hope, the final echoes of war lingered. And as the years rolled on, people would forever ask, was this truly peace, or merely a lull in the storm? In the Red Keep's throne room, Joffrey often sat alone upon the Iron Throne, the jagged steel pressing into his flesh, the old swords whispering of blood. He stared at the empty space where Tywin once stood, commanding him, controlling him. That space was empty now. For better or worse, it belonged to him. A boy no longer, he was forging his own path, in league with a man he once called traitor, if only to shatter the grip of the old lion. He waited for the next challenge, for the next betrayal, for the next wave of turmoil that would test him. And in those quiet moments, if one listened carefully, they might hear an echo of uneasy footsteps in the great hall, ghosts of those who died so one boy king might prove himself. Perhaps the day would come when the realm recognized that real power had shifted from the Lannisters to an unlikely union of 2 young kings, forging a new shape for the 7 kingdoms, or 6, or 5, or however many truly recognized Joffrey's crown. Yet it remained to be seen if that new shape would hold. If Joffrey and Robb's uneasy trust frayed, everything could crumble into a second, even bloodier war. Swords might again clash in the fields of the Riverlands, and the gates of King's Landing might once more see wolves prowling for vengeance. In the flicker of each candle, Joffrey saw the possibility of downfall. He saw the hungry stares of courtiers, the cunning eyes of Littlefinger, the silent intelligence in Varys's gaze. He saw the half-smirk Tyrion wore when they conferred. No one truly trusted him, and he trusted no one in turn. But for now, the realm endured. So ended that chapter of the War of the Five Kings. Not with a single, decisive victory, but with a dramatic betrayal that swept Tywin Lannister from the stage and replaced him with an alliance no bard would have dared to imagine. The roads were once again open, commerce picked up speed, and rumors of White Walkers and dragons overshadowed the old news of battlefields. The great Game of Thrones had changed players, but it continued still. As the wise and the foolish alike braced for what might come next, they also looked back at the day Tywin Lannister fell beneath a crossbow bolt loosed by his own grandson. That single shot broke a legend and reshaped a realm, ushering in a tenuous peace. One in which the name Joffrey Baratheon would linger at the edges of every conversation in Westeros. Of course, there were some who believed that peace was not destined to last, that men as proud and fierce as Joffrey and Robb could never truly share power. They whispered that the War of the Five Kings was but a prelude to a darker storm. Yet as the final embers of that war cooled, for a fleeting moment in a land too used to bloodshed, the swords were sheathed, the ravens carried not declarations of war but invitations and treaties, and a hush of hope mingled with the memory of terror. In that hush, Joffrey sat upon the Iron Throne, staring across the realm, waiting. And in Winterfell, Robb Stark stood by the Heart Tree, hand resting on Grey Wind's flank, eyes turned south, waiting as well. 2 young kings, bound by necessity and a shared thirst for justice or vengeance, against the unstoppable man they had stopped, each knowing that what they had forged was as brittle as the first winter ice on a dark pond. The realm held its breath, for if that ice broke, none could say how far the ripples might spread, or who might drown in the cold. The days following the uneasy establishment of peace brought a stillness to King's Landing that felt more precarious than the war itself. Where once trumpets had blared in the streets and gold-cloaked guards swaggered with the certainty of Tywin Lannister's might, now every footstep in the Red Keep carried a faint tremor of uncertainty. Servants, soldiers, and courtiers alike had learned that a single crossbow bolt could topple the highest seat of power. Whispers thrived in corridors. Alliances formed over small cups of wine in shadowed alcoves. Rivalries simmered behind every polite bow and forced smile. Joffrey Baratheon, Kinslayer, Lionslayer, Boy King, occupied the Iron Throne with the relentless vigilance of someone who knew enemies lurked both near and far. On the surface, he did as any king might do in the aftermath of civil war. Held court each morning in the Great Hall, entertained petitions, and played the game of courtesy with visiting lords. To maintain the illusion of normalcy, he ordered fresh banners hung in the yard, their crimson and gold proclaiming House Baratheon Lannister's continuing grip on the capital. But the unspoken truth lay in the new arrangements. The gold cloaks were reorganized, many of the old officers quietly dismissed or imprisoned, replaced by men whose loyalty did not rest in memory of Tywin's gold, but in a new fear of Joffrey's wrath. The infiltration squads of Northmen who had helped orchestrate Tywin's death were now part of the shadowy workings of the Red Keep. Few in number, yet wholly bound to the promise Joffrey had made with their king. The general population of King's Landing, too concerned with daily survival, scarcely understood how thoroughly the city's power structure had changed. Outside the walls, the scars of war remained. Flea Bottom had not recovered from the fire started on the night of Tywin's downfall. Parts of it were little more than ash-laden ruin, with tents springing up in the rubble. Tense lines at the bakeries made bread riot rumors spark anew every few days. Even the well-to-do quarter by the Street of Silk felt the pinch of uncertain coin flow, for the crown's treasury was far from flush. Noble visitors came and went, each sending reports back to their homes that King's Landing now belonged to a cunning but untested monarch. a boy who had proved he could slay anyone who threatened his crown, grandfather or otherwise. In the north, Robb Stark's return to Winterfell continued to reshape the region. Hard-faced stonemasons labored day after day to rebuild the ancient keep from its partial ruin. Great timbers were carted down from the Wolfswood to reinforce battered walls. The Great Hall rose anew, though some scorched stones still bore black marks from the Ironborn's desecration. Robb oversaw these works with the same measured patience that had guided him on the battlefield. Each morning, he would walk the ramparts, gray wind pacing silently at his side, and watch the laborers. Sometimes, the sight of a half-ruined tower or a scorched courtyard reminded him of the cost his people had paid for trusting the Iron Throne. Yet here he was, allied, however uneasily, with the same figure who had once ordered Ned Stark's head struck from his shoulders. Duty and necessity had a sharper edge than even ice, the old Stark greatsword now lost. Northern lords murmured their doubts. The Karstarks, the Umbers, even the Manderleys. Some questioned whether the king in the north was right to stay his hand against the Iron Throne now that Tywin lay cold in the ground. Others, less idealistic, saw a realm exhausted by war, a north that needed time to regrow its population and harvests. Would another assault on King's Landing truly avenge Ned Stark? Or would it cause fresh rivers of northern blood to run? For every lord championing vengeance, another demanded respite. And behind it all stood the memory of House Bolton's treachery in the real timeline of events. Though here, Ramsay Snow had been kept in check, and Roose Bolton seemed to remain loyal for the time being, quietly profiting from the new order. Robb knew that if this precarious peace with Joffrey failed, the North could find itself alone on a battlefield with no sure allies. South of Winterfell, Edmure Tully and Brynden Blackfish Tully worked to restore the Riverlands, a region that had become the war's favorite battlefield for too long. Burnt villages dotted the plains, their thatched roofs gone to cinders. Crops had been trampled, storehouses looted. Yet with Tywin no longer at large, Lannister outrages in the Riverlands ceased. Little by little, farmers came back to their homesteads. A season's worth of seed was salvaged for planting, and the muddy roads saw the return of peddlers and travelers. The constant presence of small Stark-led patrols on the main roads gave a semblance of security. Ravaged though the Riverlands were, many folk felt a faint pulse of hope that the worst had passed, that peace might hold. In the far west, Tyrion Lannister had embarked on the Crown's directive to subdue rebellious cousins and lesser lords of House Lannister who refused to acknowledge Joffrey's kingship. Yet Tyrion was no fool. He knew that his nephew's alliance with the North, while tactically brilliant in removing Tywin, had alienated many proud bannermen who considered the kinslaying a stain on the entire family name. Tyrion moved cautiously, relying on the cunning that had seen him survive numerous perils. He offered these would-be rebels a chance for reconciliation. Bend the knee, accept Tyrion as Warden of the West, and keep their titles and lands. Some accepted with thinly veiled disgust, as the imp was never a beloved figure among them, but his official position under the Iron Throne gave him new strength. Others, most notably Daemon Lannister, refused, holed up behind the walls of one fortress or another, vowing that the blood of the old lion would not have been spilled in vain. Throughout the villages of the Westerlands, Tyrion carried letters bearing the royal seal, yet also brandished reminders of Lannister power. Despite Tywin's death, gold still gleamed in the coffers at Casterly Rock. Bribery, negotiation, and the occasional brute force from loyal mercenaries formed his approach. Bit by bit, he reigned in the rebellious houses. Some accepted his terms. Others were made examples of. Crossbows ended a handful of petty lords who tried to rally militias. When word of these executions reached the distant hamlets, many smaller houses surrendered without a fight. The West was gradually knitting itself back under Tyrion's governance, albeit grudgingly. Still, not all was well. More than once, Tyrion woke in the night to the memory of Tywin's rigid sense of honor, hearing his father's low, disapproving growl in his mind. Now Tywin lay cold thanks to a crossbow bolt from Joffrey's own hand. Tyrion had hated Tywin, yet the man had been father, patriarch, lion. At times, Tyrion's chest squeezed with a strange bitterness at the nature of the old man's demise. Tywin, for all his cruelty, had been a pillar, and that pillar was gone, replaced by a cunning boy who might well turn on Tyrion if it served his purpose. So Tyrion played the part of loyal vassal. He wrote polite, formal letters to King's Landing and to Joffrey, updating them on the West's progress. Occasionally, he included sly references, little barbs to see if Joffrey would react. But Joffrey's responses were as measured as they were short, bearing hints that he understood Tyrion's tactics far better now than before. In King's Landing itself, the populace was slowly awakening to the fact that Cersei Lannister was no longer the hidden power behind the throne. She had been quietly confined to a suite of rooms in Maegor's Holdfast, allowed out only under guard. Some said she had gone half-mad from grief. Others whispered that she spent her days cursing her son. A few guessed that she might be forced to take the black, or even that Joffrey might one day quietly snuff out her life. Yet, for all his hardness, Joffrey had not taken that step. Perhaps he still clung to some vestige of filial sentiment, or perhaps he found it more gratifying to keep her locked away, a living testament to his triumph over all who once controlled him. Margaery Tyrell found her position even more precarious. She had come to King's Landing to be a queen in a grand alliance that tied House Tyrell to House Lannister. Now, with Tywin gone and Cersei disgraced, Margaery was a queen-to-be presiding over a realm that seethed with tensions. She played the role with the skill her grandmother Olenna had taught her, smiling graciously, hosting little courtly fetes, handing out bread to the poor in public acts of charity. But behind her luminous smiles, she struggled to parse the new Joffrey, the king who held on to power with a cunning that rivaled, and perhaps surpassed, his mother's. He was no longer the tantrum-throwing child so easily shaped by older hands. The rumors of how he orchestrated Tywin's downfall had spread, though the details were murky. Some told it as though Joffrey himself lit the fires in Flea Bottom and personally slew half the city watch. Others said he had done nothing but shoot his crossbow while others fought. But the consistent thread was that Joffrey himself pulled the trigger. He had parted Tywin's soul from his body and changed the fate of the war. Margaery, seeing the cold light in Joffrey's eyes, realized he was not the boy who once forced her to endure savage japes for amusement. He was a king who made strategic decisions, as lethal as any grown warlord. Her family back in Highgarden grumbled about the new arrangement. The Tyrells had never desired a permanent division of the realm that allowed the North to be semi-independent. They wanted a united Westeros, ideally with themselves in prime position next to the throne. Olenna Tyrell, sharp-tongued, formidable, spoke openly of sending Mace Tyrell to parley with Joffrey. But each time the risk seemed too high. Joffrey held Margaery hostage by marriage ties, albeit in a velvet-gloved fashion. Should the Tyrells provoke him, they might find themselves locked out of King's Landing or stripped of their privileges. Meanwhile, Robb Stark's infiltration squads still lurked in King's Landing in subtle ways, though many had been replaced or rotated out. Their presence served as a hidden guarantee that Joffrey would uphold his agreement with the North. At times, these quiet watchers noticed a peculiar shift in Joffrey's style. He rarely indulged in gratuitous displays of cruelty, though, when it suited him, he made examples of those who defied him. He began funneling modest amounts of the treasury toward rebuilding parts of King's Landing that had been badly damaged in the fighting. He hosted small banquets for foreign merchants to encourage the reemergence of trade. And he courted the faith of the Seven, easing restrictions on septons who preached in the squares. Some on the small council, Varys Littlefinger Pycelle, marveled at how Joffrey had grown. The cunning was real. The cruelty lurked just beneath. He had locked away his mother. He had outmaneuvered his uncle Tyrion, at least so far. He had made peace with the one force Tywin could not smash, Robb Stark's north. However, court intrigues never ceased. Sansa Stark had already left the city under an escort, returning north with a mixture of relief and residual terror. Other great houses wanted to see if Joffrey would keep the peace or break it once he was stronger. It was at this time that the Vale, ruled by the boy Robert Arryn and guided by Peter Baelish, grew even more reclusive. Officially, the Vale was not at war with the Iron Throne, but they had closed their mountain passes to refugees. They recognized Joffrey's claim nominally, sending polite messages but rarely sending men or gold. Littlefinger was playing his own game from the Eyrie, rumored to be shaping the Vale into his personal stronghold. Varys' spies hinted that Baelish might attempt to marry Lysa Arryn himself, further consolidating power. But how that might intersect with Joffrey's precarious monarchy was anyone's guess. For his part, Joffrey felt the weight of the realm pressing on him like a lead cloak. Each morning, before he went to the throne room, he checked the yard where a new retinue of gold cloaks drilled with pikes, or he conferred with the master of coin over the empty coffers. Tyrion had not yet resumed that position. Instead, Littlefinger had reclaimed it. Baelish's mild jokes and obsequious bows did not fool Joffrey. He knew the man was dangerous, but Peter was the best at coaxing money from the murk of war-torn Westeros. The shipping lanes needed to be reopened to bring in coin from tariffs. The spice traders from Essos needed safe conduct. Even the Iron Bank of Bravos demanded repayment. Joffrey was discovering a side of kingship that Tywin had once handled for him: finances, debts, trade treaties. And the deeper he waded into such issues, the more he hated the complexities. In his nights, Joffrey often tossed on his bed, dreaming of Ned Stark's head, of Tywin's dying glare, of crossbow bolts dripping blood. The new Red Keep was not as comfortable to him as it should have been. Ghosts walked those halls. He sometimes thought of Robert Baratheon, the father he barely knew, and wondered if the old drunken warrior king would have found a simpler path. But Robert had simply battered aside obstacles with raw force. That was not an option for a king enthroned by a web of alliances and assassinations. Half a year after the dramatic fall of Tywin, word arrived that Stannis Baratheon was on the move again. Scouts reported that he was gathering ships in the Narrow Sea, perhaps thinking of a second attempt to seize King's Landing or to sail north to the Wall. Rumors from Dragonstone mentioned a Red Priestess, Melisandre, speaking of portents in the flames. People in the city still recalled the terror of the Blackwater, how wildfire turned the bay into a lake of green fire. Even though Tywin's victory there was moot now, the memory of Stannis' ambition lingered. Joffrey recognized that if Stannis attacked while the realm was still reeling, it could tear everything apart. He also recognized that an open confrontation might make Stannis into a martyr, or hand him the support of those who still labeled Joffrey a bastard child of Cersei and Jaime. So, he turned to a new plan, one gleaned from Varys' murmurs. There was talk that Stannis had considered riding to the Wall to defend against rumored threats from beyond, White Walkers or wildling invasions. It seemed a mad fancy to many, but if that was indeed Stannis' plan, he might soon leave Dragonstone underdefended. Joffrey seized the hint and arranged for a bold proposition. Should Stannis ride north, perhaps he could be drawn into a parley with Robb Stark, who was recognized as king in the north. Then the northern forces could entangle Stannis or break his cause. Word traveled to Winterfell. Robb Stark, however, had his own counsel to consider. He was uneasy about turning the north into a battlefield once more, especially if the threat of White Walkers, an ancient horror his father had occasionally mentioned, proved real. The Night's Watch sent ravens to all corners of the realm, warning of gathering wildlings and possible undead beyond the Wall. Many in the south dismissed it as old superstition. But in the north, such fears could not be cast aside lightly. If Stannis and his Red Priestess truly intended to march to the Wall, they might do so to rally the Night's Watch or seize the vantage of the far north. Robb did not know. He debated with his chief bannermen, the Great John, Roose Bolton, Galbart Glover, Lady Mormont. The consensus was cautious. Let Stannis come. If he truly intended to fight the undead threat, so be it. If he tried to subjugate the north, they would meet him on the field. Only Roose Bolton spoke up with a quieter suggestion of subterfuge, perhaps capturing Stannis before he even arrived at the Wall. Robb hesitated. The entire realm teetered on a knife's edge, and a conflict with Stannis might unravel the fragile peace with Joffrey. If House Baratheon of Dragonstone demanded the crown, would Joffrey be forced to commit men to a war that pitted his alliance with the North against his own uncle's claim? Back in the capital, Joffrey's small council wrestled with the question as well. Pycelle, quavering with age, insisted that a direct show of force, a fleet sent to smash Dragonstone, would be best. Varys counseled patience. Littlefinger worried about the cost of a naval expedition. Joffrey, presiding over them all, kept silent until the arguments waned, then curtly declared that for now, the crown would not waste ships attacking Dragonstone. If Stannis sailed north, let him. If he marched on King's Landing again, they would respond. The meeting ended with no consensus on how to deal with the Red Priestess or the rumored dark magic swirling around Stannis' camp. Even as the threat of Stannis brewed, a second storm gathered, the Ironborn. Balon Greyjoy, having earlier declared himself king of the Isles and the North, had been dealt a harsh blow when his men were driven from Winterfell and the northern coasts. Yet the Ironborn were not wholly defeated. From Pike, Balon seethed over the humiliations inflicted on his raiders by both the Starks and their allies. Now that the North was free from Lannister invasions, the Northerners had more resources to repel Ironborn raids, but that did not stop the Ironborn from launching smaller, vicious forays along the stony shore. They were a persistent threat that demanded Robb Stark's attention. A letter from Balon arrived in Winterfell, filled with mockery. He demanded recognition of the Iron Islands' independence and ownership of the northwestern coast. He claimed he would continue to raid until his terms were met. Robb and his council laughed bitterly. They had no intention of granting the Ironborn a single clod of northern soil. But the letter forced them to consider that the war for northern freedom was not truly over. If the Ironborn escalated attacks, Robb might be forced to strike back in earnest, which would divert men and resources that might otherwise protect the wall. Thus, the realm found itself in a puzzle of shifting loyalties and threats. Joffrey, ironically, was left to manage a fragile alliance with Robb Stark that existed mostly on paper. Their arrangement depended on the understanding that neither side sought open war, and that Tywin's downfall had removed the root cause of so many hostilities. Yet the realm had many other roots of conflict, enough for several lifetimes. In the Red Keep, Joffrey's nights of uneasy dreams multiplied. It was in this environment that a new wave of rumor erupted, carried by foreign merchants out of Pentos and Volantis. A Targaryen girl had surfaced in Slaver's Bay, amassing armies and, if whispers were to be believed, dragons. At first, the rumor was scoffed at by many in King's Landing, who remembered the short-lived sightings of Blackfyre pretenders or other false Targaryens over the years. Pycelle harumphed at the very suggestion, while Littlefinger slyly implied that he might have distant contacts who had heard the same. Varys, uncharacteristically tight-lipped, said little. But the rumor persisted, stirring old memories of the Mad King, old loyalties that might still linger in the shadows. If dragons truly existed again, how long before they set their sights on Westeros and the Iron Throne? To Joffrey, the notion of a Targaryen threat was unnerving. Hadn't Robert Baratheon, the man Joffrey called father, spilled barrels of blood to secure the throne from the Targaryens? Yet the realm now was so fractured that a foreign invasion, if it came, might unify or destroy them all. Joffrey ordered Varys to keep an ear to the ground for more precise news. He also penned a careful, coded letter to Robb Stark, vaguely mentioning the possibility of an exiled Targaryen stirring abroad, along with the question of whether the North would remain neutral if such a threat arrived. Robb's reply came many weeks later, equally measured, stating that the North would defend its own borders but had no interest in meddling with southern wars, unless such wars threatened to spill onto northern soil. Despite these mounting concerns, the uneasy realm stumbled through a patch of relative calm for a time. Crops grew in the riverlands, trade trickled along the roads. The war machines that had once thundered across Westeros were stilled. Marjorie Tyrell hosted a harvest feast in King's Landing that brought a semblance of gaiety to the court. She smiled in her graceful way, wearing gowns of green and gold, and presided over a tournament that Joffrey approved. The boy king watched from the stands with an air of faint boredom, though occasionally he smirked when a knight in Lannister crimson was unhorsed by a lesser-known hedge knight. The small folk turned out for the spectacle, seeing in the pageantry an echo of better days under King Robert's reign, when tournaments were frequent. Yet beneath the tilting lances and bright pavilions, tension seethed. Courtiers gossiped about how the Tyrells might eventually break with Joffrey if he continued to keep them at arm's length. Others wondered if the next bolt from Joffrey's crossbow might catch a new target. The king had grown unpredictably still in manner. He rarely raged or threatened publicly, though from time to time a jape or an insult would slip from his mouth, reminding everyone of the cruelty that lurked within. The day after the harvest feast, a hush fell upon the capital when a battered courier arrived at the gates, bearing news that Daemon Lannister in the Westerlands had mounted an open rebellion. Tyrion's attempts at diplomacy had failed with Daemon. The rebel had seized a minor fortress, declared Joffrey a bastard and a kinslayer unfit to reign, and invited any disillusioned lords to join him. Worse, Daemon had apparently reached out to certain disgruntled Tyrell bannermen, who disliked the fact that Margaery was in King's Landing as a hostage queen. If these elements combined, they might form a small but dangerous confederation in the southern Westerlands and northern Reach. Joffrey called a council meeting that same night. Tyrion had ridden back from the west, weary and dusty from the road, to give his account in person. He explained that Daemon Lannister was not well loved, but he had enough gold and enough hatred to cause trouble. His claims would resonate with some. After all, the idea that Joffrey was Jaime's son, not Robert's, was common rumor. Men might rally to Daemon out of fervor for House Lannister's true legacy or out of personal resentment of Joffrey. Let us crush this. If some in the Reach are sympathetic to Daemon, the Tyrells might view a royal host in their territory as an invasion. We'd have a second war. Joffrey, seated at the head of the table, tapped his fingers on the wood. His gaze fell on Margaery, who stood in the corner as an observer. She was not officially on the small council, but as the betrothed queen, she often attended. She did not flinch under his scrutiny, but she inclined her head slightly, as if to say she understood the threat to her family's region. Finally, Joffrey spoke. We will not let some rebellious cur nibble at our heels, but we also will not blunder into an open conflict with the Reach. Margaery, send word to your family. Let them know I expect them to quell any local lords who might be inclined to side with Daemon. If they do not, they will answer to the crown for failing to maintain their lands. Tyrion, you will raise a modest force in the Westerlands to march on Daemon's fortress. Keep it small enough that the Tyrells do not fear an invasion of their domain. He paused, eyes flicking to Varys. The Master of Whisperers will ensure no foreign power or ill rumor fans these flames into a wider blaze. And if the rebels cannot be persuaded to lay down arms, we will end them. Publicly, the plan, though precarious, set in motion. Letters flew. From Joffrey to Olenna Tyrell, from Margaery to her father Mace, from Tyrion to half a dozen minor Lannister bannermen, each letter reminding them of the benefits of bending the knee and the dire consequences of rebellion. Then Tyrion departed once more for the west, cursing the dust of the roads, determined to resolve Daemon's uprising before it spiraled. As Tyrion traveled, he considered the role that Robb Stark's alliance might play. The North was not directly involved, but in a realm as entangled as Westeros, any spark could set ablaze the entire tapestry. If the West turned into a war zone, the Tyrells might sense weakness in Joffrey's hold on the throne. The North might remain aloof or might see an opportunity to press for further concessions. Tyrion took a grim satisfaction in realizing that by slaying Tywin, Joffrey had undone the strongest unifying force in House Lannister, and ironically had made himself reliant on the North, the Tyrells, and men like Tyrion to keep the realm intact. At the same time these tensions flared in the West, Robb Stark faced a new crisis of his own. Word came that the Ironborn were amassing ships near the Cape of Eagles, apparently planning a bold strike deeper into the North's western coast. The attacks on the stony shore had been trifling. This threatened to be a larger incursion. Worse, a raven from the Night's Watch arrived at Winterfell, reporting a great gathering of wildlings beyond the wall, led by a king beyond the wall named Mance Rayder. Whispers of the dead rising, the White Walkers stirring, grew more frequent. The Watch pleaded for aid. Robb found himself torn in two directions, safeguarding the coast from Balon Greyjoy's new threat and supporting the Watch at the Wall. The Northern Lords argued among themselves. The Great John roared that the Ironborn had to be put in their place once and for all. Roose Bolton, calm as a serpent, suggested letting the Ironborn land and then crushing them on the ground. Catelyn Stark, in a quiet voice, reminded everyone that the threats beyond the wall could make petty southern squabbles meaningless. And somewhere in the midst of these heated discussions, Robb remembered a small line in one of Joffrey's letters, an oddly prescient note about how the realm might need to unify against a greater enemy someday. Did Joffrey truly believe in the White Walkers, or had he merely been paying lip service to rumors? Regardless, Robb dispatched a portion of his forces under trusted bannermen to guard the coast. He then decided to march north himself, at least as far as Castle Black, to see for his own eyes what was happening beyond the wall. The king in the north on the move, this was a decision that might have significant impact on the realm. Should Robb become embroiled in battles against wildlings or worse, he might be unable to quell an Ironborn incursion. But he could not ignore the Watch's plea. Ned Stark had always taught him that the Night's Watch was an ancient shield, and if they were truly threatened, the North must heed the call. He parted Winterfell on a cold dawn, leaving Catelyn in command as regent, along with a council that included Roose Bolton and others. Grey wind bounded at Robb's side as they rode northward, black cloaks billowing behind them. Columns of Northmen followed, fewer than in the war's height but still a formidable force. They aimed to reach Castle Black before the snows grew deeper. Along the way, they stopped in small towns where people whispered about the king in the North's journey to face strange foes. Some folks told old tales of the long night, children of the forest, white shadows. Robb listened with a stone face, refusing to dismiss any rumor outright. At Castle Black, Jon Snow, Robb's half-brother, or so they believed, was a rising figure among the Night's Watch. Though the timeline had shifted from canon, some things stayed the same. Jon had gone north, learned of Mance Rayder, and discovered growing signs that the dead might walk. He had no knowledge of Joffrey's alliance with Robb, not truly. The news from the south reached the Wall only in patches, and the Black brothers had little interest in which king claimed which throne, so long as they would send support. But hearing that Robb Stark himself was coming with an army caused more than a few raised eyebrows among the Watch. When Robb arrived, brother and half-brother embraced in a moment that momentarily bridged the gap between them. Jon wore the black cloak of the Watch, a seriousness in his eyes that seemed beyond his years. Robb was haggard from months of war and the burdens of kingship. They retreated into a quiet corner of Castle Black to speak of what each had learned. Jon recounted the wildling threat, thousands of free folk potentially uniting under Mance Rayder. He also hinted at darker rumors. Whites, corpses animated by some fell power, glimpsed by rangers in the far north. Robb listened, conscious that if even a fraction of this was true, Westeros faced a foe beyond any measure of conventional war. Yet the question remained, what could the king in the north do about it? If he committed his forces to the far side of the Wall, he risked leaving the coastline vulnerable to the Ironborn. If Mance Rayder's army attacked, would the Black brothers alone suffice to hold them off? And if the rumors of White Walkers were accurate, an even greater crisis loomed. Robb found his mind drifting south to Joffrey, that improbable ally. Would the Iron Throne stand idle if the others marched beyond the Wall? Likely yes, for the Southern kings seldom believed in the old stories. Still, Robb penned a letter to Joffrey, urging him to be ready. He avoided direct mention of the White Walkers, but he stressed that the northern border might become a battlefield not just with wildlings but with unknown forces. He asked if the crown might dispatch supplies or reinforcements to Castle Black, or at least refrain from any further entanglements that would hamper the north. That letter went out via Raven, uncertain if Joffrey would care or even respond. In King's Landing, Joffrey received Robb's message amid the swirl of dealing with Daemon Lannister's rebellion. The letter, read aloud in the small council, caused some mocking laughter from Pycelle. The boy king in the north would have us supply his frozen wasteland? But Joffrey's face remained inscrutable. He had felt a strange shift inside himself when he read the lines about a vast threat beyond the Wall. Perhaps it was fear, or perhaps it was the memory of the old stories. Once, as a child, he had heard old Nan's tales, though Cersei had quickly driven her away. Or maybe it was the realization that if the North collapsed under some unimaginable menace, Joffrey's entire alliance would unravel. He surprised the council by ordering a modest shipment of grain and equipment for the Night's Watch. "It is our duty as the Iron Throne to protect all realms of men," he said in a dry tone, repeating a phrase from old history. Cersei would have sneered at such a notion. Tyrion might have tried to weasel out of the cost. But Joffrey was no longer reliant on the old ways of thinking. The cost was small, a gesture of minimal consequence. And yet it might tie the North closer to him, as well as ensure that if the wildlings attacked, the Night's Watch would not break. So a trickle of wagons set out from King's Landing, loaded with grain, dragonglass arrowheads rumored to be effective against certain foes, and a few old suits of armor gleaned from the Red Keep's armories. If that was not enough, well, at least it was a gesture that no one expected from the boy who once had Ned Stark beheaded. Some courtiers quietly muttered that Joffrey was either growing soft or preparing for a cunning trap. Marjorie Tyrell, observing from the sidelines, wondered if Joffrey truly believed in the threat beyond the wall. She could not tell. Meanwhile, the rebellion in the Westerlands escalated. Daemon Lannister had formed alliances with a few minor Reach lords along the border, men who despised the Tyrells' closeness to the crown. The Tyrells themselves sent a message to Joffrey that they would handle the descent in the Reach, but that Daemon was his to deal with. When Tyrion arrived with a modest force outside Daemon's fortress, he discovered the rebels had mustered a couple thousand men. More than expected. They hoisted a banner showing the Golden Lion rampant on crimson, but defiled with black ribbons symbolizing mourning for Tywin. Their message was clear: Joffrey is false, and we uphold the true Lannister legacy. Tyrion negotiated. He offered gold, pardons, positions of influence in the West. Daemon refused. The next day, a small skirmish broke out near the fortress gates. Tyrion's men fought hard, and with the help of crossbowmen, they inflicted painful losses on the rebels. But it was no decisive victory, and Tyrion worried that if he laid siege, the rebels might hold out long enough for other dissatisfied houses to join them. He wrote to Joffrey, requesting reinforcements. Joffrey, faced with an already short supply of loyal troops in King's Landing, hesitated. He did not want to strip the capital's defenses or look weak in the eyes of the Tyrells. So he sent a letter instructing Tyrion to wrap up the matter quickly, by any means. That was how Tyrion found himself forced to take a page from the Lannister Book of Cruelty. Under the cover of night, he hired mercenaries to scale a less guarded section of the fortress wall and open a side gate. They succeeded, though at heavy cost. In the ensuing chaos, Tyrion's men stormed inside, locked the main gate behind them, and trapped Daemon's rebels within. Dawn broke on screams echoing in the courtyard. Many rebels yielded. Others fought to the death. Daemon himself tried to rally his men but was caught by a quarrel through the neck. As he lay choking on his own blood, Tyrion hobbled forward, meeting the eyes of this distant cousin for the first time. Daemon tried to speak, perhaps to hurl a curse or defiance, but no sound came. He died there on the blood-slick stones, and with him the last real chance for a serious rebellion in the West. The fortress fell. News spread quickly that Tyrion had dealt with the traitors, though it was a savage business. Tyrion's men took trophies, among them Daemon's signet ring. The survivors were given a choice: bend the knee or face execution. Most bent. Tyrion, in a black mood, ordered the ringleaders hanged at once. The rest he promised to spare if they swore fealty to Joffrey. Forced loyalty, perhaps, but effective enough. Then, with the castle secured, Tyrion sent riders with word of victory to King's Landing. The rebel heads were tarred and mounted on spikes near the gate as a grim deterrent. Thus ended the Lannister insurrection, though the cost in blood and hatred would echo for years to come. When Joffrey heard the news, he felt both relief and a faint pang of unease. He had not personally given the order for such brutality. He had only told Tyrion to wrap things up. But the result was a testament to what might happen if any lord challenged the new order. In the Great Hall, Joffrey publicly praised Tyrion's efforts, calling him the peacemaker of the West. Tyrion received the praise with a small bow and a half-smile, but inside, he knew how flimsy that peace might prove if bigger powers rose against them. That same day, a letter arrived from Robb Stark, acknowledging the shipments to the Night's Watch with curt thanks. Robb noted that the Watch had already begun to see wildling scouts crossing the wall in small numbers, testing the defenses. He wrote that if a great host attacked, the Watch alone might not hold them off. The letter ended with a subtle plea. The realm has many kings, but this foe makes no distinction. The North will do what it must. It was the closest Robb had come to suggesting that the entire realm might need to unify for the sake of the wall. Joffrey read the letter twice, his expression unreadable. Then, with a short laugh that sounded more forced than amused, he tucked it away. The small council, if told of this letter, would likely scorn the idea that the South must come to the North's aid for some savage horde in the wilderness. He himself might have mocked it once, but the memory of that old sense of fear, of nameless monsters in the night, clung to him in a way he could not dismiss. Still, for the time being, the Southern realm had pressing concerns, ensuring the Tyrell alliance, pacifying the West, and watching for any sign that Stannis might sail from Dragonstone or that Balon Greyjoy might escalate attacks. Winter had not yet clamped down on the South, though the nights grew cooler, and caravans from the Reach brought early winter harvests to feed King's Landing. Margaery Tyrell's presence at court grew more influential, as she charmed many lords with her radiant courtesy. Some even whispered that the king seemed softened by her, though she was careful to hide whether she felt anything akin to true affection for Joffrey. For his part, Joffrey recognized that a union with the Tyrells was vital to secure the city's food supply. He could no longer rely on the Westerlands in the same absolute way Tywin had. The rebellious rifts in the west had not fully healed, and Tyrion was still stamping out smaller embers. Meanwhile, the Tyrell bannermen once again muttered that their beloved Rose Marjorie was a prisoner in all but name. So, with carefully calculated drama, Joffrey announced that their wedding would finally proceed in the early weeks of the new year, an event that might help unify the realm and reassure the Tyrells of his commitment. Preparations began. Tailors stitched elaborate garments of gold thread and subtle green leaf motifs for the queen-to-be. Bakers tested sweet pastries and lemon cakes. Jugglers and acrobats were hired. Musicians from across the narrow sea promised to attend. The city stirred with excitement, hoping for a lavish spectacle reminiscent of the old days of Robert's reign. Joffrey resolved that no expense would be spared. He wanted the realm to see him as a king worthy of celebration, not just fear. But as the wedding day approached, the tension around King's Landing became almost suffocating. Every major house that recognized Joffrey was invited to send representatives. Even the North was invited, though few expected Robb Stark to attend, given the distance and the enmity that still lay between them. Yet the possibility of a northern envoy sparked speculation. Might the young wolf himself come, if only to prove this alliance was sincere? Or would he send others, such as the Blackfish or Edmure Tully or even Sansa? But Sansa had vanished back into the north, and none were certain she would return to King's Landing willingly. To Joffrey's surprise, a raven eventually arrived from Winterfell with a short response from Robb. He would not attend in person. His duties to the wall and the defense of the north were too great. But he would dispatch a pair of high-ranking bannermen as observers, if only to ensure the alliance was recognized. Joffrey read this with a mixture of relief and disappointment. Secretly, some part of him had wanted Robb to come in person. Perhaps it was a desire to rub the splendor of his rule in the wolf's face, or to put old grudges to rest in a final display of power. But the king in the north would not abandon his post. So, the wedding day dawned on a crisp morning that smelled of sea salt and the last hints of autumn. A retinue of Yrell guards in polished armor lined the streets, joined by the gold cloaks in newly minted tabards. Green, gold, and crimson bunting fluttered above the cobblestones. Small folk turned out in droves, eager for spectacle. Many recalled the horrors of war but hoped that a royal wedding might herald true peace, as improbable as that seemed. The ceremony took place in the Great September of Baelor, a solemn and imposing structure that dwarfed the wedding party. 7 crystal towers caught the morning light, sending rainbow shards dancing over the city. The High Septon presided with all due pomp. Joffrey wore a tunic of cloth of gold, studded with tiny garnets shaped like lion heads, though a single black stag was emblazoned over his heart. His expression was set, neither joyous nor grim, but determined. At his side, Margaery Tyrell glided in a gown that hinted at roses in bloom. Her hair was coiled in intricate braids, pearls woven among the curls. She wore the faintest smile, the perfect mask of a queen stepping into the lion's den. Beneath the domed ceiling, lit by countless candles, they said their vows. The high septon anointed their brows with holy oils. Bells tolled outside, echoing across King's Landing. Lords and ladies from across the realm, those who could stomach the event, watched in respectful silence. The Reach was well represented by Mace Tyrell, who looked puffed with pride, while Olenna Tyrell sat quietly, hawk-eyed. A small contingent from the north, led by a lesser lord sworn to House Glover, stood on the periphery, their faces unreadable. Tyrion Lannister had returned from the west for the occasion, wearing a black and gold doublet, sipping wine and ignoring the pointed gazes from other Lannisters who despised him. When the ceremony concluded, trumpets pealed, and the city erupted in cheering. Or at least, enough people cheered to create an echo of celebration. A wave of relief passed through many. The war was over, the alliance with the Tyrells secured. Some believed the realm might finally see lasting peace. Others whispered that the new queen was a hostage, that the king was a monster, that war still smoldered in the corners of Westeros. The feast that followed was lavish indeed, with tables stretching the length of the Red Keep's outer yard. Roast boar, succulent trout from the Blackwater Rush, lemon cakes, sweetbreads, and strong arbor wine. Jugglers tossed flaming torches. Bards sang of gallant knights and fair maids. Joffrey toasted Marjorie, calling her the brightest rose of the Reach. Marjorie returned the courtesy, praising Joffrey's bravery and dedication to the realm. The guests indulged. Cups were drained, laughter rang out, and the tension almost seemed to ease. But as the day wore on, some watchers saw that Joffrey's eyes never lost that keen edge, as if he expected betrayal at any moment. He had stationed gold cloaks and Northman infiltrators in strategic corners, ensuring no pockets of rebellion could mar the wedding. Marjorie's family, too, had ringed her with Tyrell swordsmen, never letting her stray too far into the throngs. The ephemeral veneer of joy could not conceal the underlying wariness. Late in the evening, after the final course and the customary bedding ceremony, carried out with somewhat more decorum than some in the court had expected, the newlywed king and queen retired behind closed doors. The courtyard remained full of drunken revelers, half aware that the real power plays of the night might be taking place in private. In a side chamber, Tyrion sipped from his goblet, exchanging brittle pleasantries with Mace Tyrell, while Olenna grilled him about the state of the West. Meanwhile, in a discreet alcove, a northern envoy murmured with Varys, gleaning rumors of the threatened wildling invasion. Soon, the festivities wound down. The wedding day ended with the capital still standing. No sudden bloodshed or hidden crossbow bolts aimed at the dais. If some among the watchers had expected a dreadful repeat of past wedding horrors, like the rumors of the Red Wedding that once haunted the Riverlands, none occurred. Dawn broke on a new day with the realm's eyes set upon King Joffrey and Queen Marjorie, uncertain whether to hope or fear for the future. In the moons that followed, the alliance with the Tyrells solidified, albeit with delicate negotiations over trade routes and who would hold what offices. Marjorie, as queen, began organizing charitable works in King's Landing, distributing bread in the poorest districts, winning the hearts of some commoners. Joffrey supported these efforts in a reserved way, no longer mocking charity as weakness, but not championing it with enthusiasm either. He understood the value of seeming benevolent to the small folk, even if his personal disposition had hardly changed. The North, for its part, braced for the onslaught of winter as reports came that the wildlings were gathering in record numbers near the wall. Small skirmishes broke out, leading to wounded Black brothers. Robb Stark remained near Castle Black with a detachment of his best warriors, uncertain if he might soon face a test far graver than any faced in the War of the Five Kings. In quiet nights, he thought of his father, who once taught him the responsibilities of a lord. Now he was a king, burdened by a realm that might soon face an unimaginable enemy. Beyond that, the Iron Islands continued to probe the coastline, raiding fishing villages. And though Joffrey had kept the lines of communication open, no further offers of southern men or resources had arrived. The North stood alone in more ways than one. On the Iron Throne, Joffrey presided over new trials and disputes. The City Watch arrested a handful of conspirators who had apparently tried to slip poison into a cask of wine intended for the wedding. Upon interrogation, some said torture, they confessed to being hired by unknown agents in the Westerlands who remained bitterly loyal to Tywin's memory. Joffrey had them executed without fanfare. Another day, a delegation from Dorne arrived, led by Oberyn Martell's kin, scowling at the mention of the Lannisters. The tension with Dorne over Elia Martell's death in the Sack of King's Landing still lingered, overshadowing any possible alliance. Joffrey had to handle the Dornish with caution, aware that if they turned openly hostile, the southern border might erupt. In the west, Tyrion slowly restored order, though rebellions could spark anew at any time. He held court in Casterly Rock, a place still haunted by Tywin's absence. Tyrion's wife, if he had one in this alternate story, is overshadowed by his single-minded focus on preventing further unrest. Each day, messages flew between Tyrion and King's Landing, coordinating finances, shipments of gold, and ensuring that taxes flowed into the royal treasury. From across the narrow sea, the merchants' rumors of a Targaryen with dragons persisted, though no sign of an imminent invasion appeared. Still, the knowledge that such a wild card existed unnerved those in power. Some speculated that if a Targaryen truly had dragons, she might land in Dorne or the Stormlands and attempt to raise the banner of House Targaryen once again. And how would Joffrey respond? Even if the realm outwardly recognized him as king, a Targaryen claimant with living dragons could light half the continent on fire. Seasons shifted further. Snow began to dust the north in earnest, blanketing Winterfell and the lands beyond with a white hush. At the Wall, the cold deepened, the sun growing pale. Robb Stark and the Night's Watch prepared for the worst. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, the climate remained gentler, but the gloom of winter manifested in the hearts of many who remembered the old tragedies. Whispers of Stannis flared and died. Apparently, the would-be king had indeed gone north, but to what end, no one knew. Perhaps he had taken a handful of ships and men to Eastwatch by the sea, seeking to be the realm's savior or to carve out a domain in the frozen wastes. If so, he was not in King's Landing threatening Joffrey, at least for now. In the midst of all this, Joffrey's rule began to develop a signature style, one shaped by fear but tempered by cunning. He held elaborate feasts occasionally, more subdued than his wedding, awarding loyal lords with titles or gifts. He courted the faith's favor, funding minor improvements to the septs. He permitted Margaery's charitable works, though he never personally engaged with them beyond occasional forced smiles. To the small council, he remained curt, demanding results and punishing failure mercilessly. Some said he was haunted, for they would catch him in the corridors late at night, pacing, crossbow slung across his back. Others claimed he was simply becoming the perfect Lannister tyrant, albeit one who had ironically ended Tywin's line. Robb Stark, in distant Winterfell or near Castle Black, oversaw his own realm with a more measured hand. Stories spread that the king in the north rode patrols with his men, ensuring discipline and readiness for the battles to come. House Bolton, House Manderly, House Umber, and others took turns sending men to the Wall or to guard the coasts. The tension with the Iron Islands continued, though Balon Greyjoy had not launched a major invasion. Yet what truly loomed, overshadowing all these personal quarrels, was the question of whether the winter would bring a cataclysm. Old codgers in the north muttered that this winter could be the darkest in memory. Rumors filtering back from the far end of the Frostfangs hinted at unnatural sightings. Entire villages abandoned, footprints in the snow shaped like no man or beast. The Black Brothers stationed on remote sections of the Wall spoke in hushed voices of glimpses of pale shapes in the night. The younger recruits laughed it off, until one of them vanished on a patrol. In King's Landing, such tales were distant. People worried more about bread prices, about theft in the streets, about pleasing or avoiding the king's attention. But Joffrey, with the occasional letter from Robb, could not entirely dismiss the possibility that the North might soon be embroiled in a struggle unlike any Westeros had seen in thousands of years. The precarious alliance they had forged, Wolf and Lionstag, could be put to the test if the others truly poured south. One night, during an unseasonable chill, Joffrey hosted an intimate feast in the smaller banquet hall, joined by Margaery, Tyrion, visiting from the west again, Varys, Littlefinger, and a few other dignitaries. The talk turned to the north. Tyrion asked if Joffrey meant to keep supporting the Night's Watch with token shipments. Joffrey nodded slowly and mentioned sending a few more wagons of dragonglass, as the Watchers had requested. Littlefinger snorted quietly, questioning the cost-benefit. Margaery, less skeptical, praised the generosity. Joffrey brushed aside the remarks and turned the conversation to other matters, though he noted Tyrion's curious expression. The imp had lived among the Black brothers briefly, and perhaps he alone understood the scale of the threat. Later that evening, once the guests departed, Tyrion lingered in the corridor outside Joffrey's solar. The torches sputtered, casting flickering shadows. Joffrey stepped out, crossbow hanging at his side. Their eyes met. Tyrion offered a small bow. "You're being uncommonly charitable toward the Night's Watch. I recall you once threatened to execute the entire watch for being traitors or some nonsense." Joffrey stiffened. Times change. Indeed. Tyrion's mismatched eyes glinted with a trace of curiosity. "I wonder if you're beginning to see that holding the throne is not merely about punishing enemies, or if you suspect there's a bigger game afoot." Joffrey's jaw clenched. For a moment, it seemed he might lash out, but he only said, "If the North falls, the realm might be overrun. I won't let that happen. Not when I have fought so hard to rule." Tyrion nodded. "Pragmatic enough. Father would have done the same, I imagine, though with less subtlety." He paused, searching Joffrey's face. "Do you ever regret it?" Joffrey's eyes flickered with cold light. He knew precisely what Tyrion meant. "Do you regret shooting Tywin?" But he did not answer. He turned away, the crossbow scraping against the wall. When he spoke, his voice was distant. "Tywin would never have allowed me to be king in truth. I had no choice." The words hung in the air. Tyrion let out a soft sigh. "No, I suppose you didn't." And then they parted, each carrying unspoken burdens. Tyrion left for his chambers, while Joffrey continued to wander the halls of the Red Keep, the route he often took to quell his roiling thoughts. From a window slit, he gazed across King's Landing. Shadows rippled on the rooftops. Somewhere, across the black water of the bay, the open sea stretched toward foreign lands. Perhaps that Targaryen girl with her rumored dragons was out there, preparing to cross. Perhaps the others truly threatened from the north. Perhaps Stannis or the Ironborn or Dorne would strike. The realm was a shifting minefield. Yet for now he was king. A year ago he'd been a puppet. Now the strings were severed. He had done the unthinkable, and if the gods deemed it a sin, they had yet to punish him, unless the nightmares counted as punishment. He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling his heart hammer. In that frantic rhythm, he heard the pulse of a realm perched on the edge of winter's sword. In the north, weeks later, the final seeds of war beyond the wall took root. Mance Rayder's army pressed forward in greater numbers, skirmishing near the Shadow Tower. The Night's Watch lit signal fires. Robb Stark responded by rallying his men, forming lines of defense at key points along the wall. The few southern observers who had ventured north wrote frantic letters back to King's Landing, describing thousands of wildlings. Giants, mammoths, spearwives, strange pale creatures at the edges of the night. These letters made their way through couriers, each more alarming than the last, though many in the south dismissed it as exaggeration. But Joffrey took them seriously enough to instruct Tyrion to stand ready. If the north demanded more aid, they would have to decide how many men the crown could spare. The Tyrells were in no hurry to send their armies into a frozen wasteland, but Margaery quietly encouraged some measure of help, if only to keep the north from turning on them in the future. So a modest plan began forming. If the wall truly came under siege, Joffrey might dispatch a royal force to assist, perhaps forging a public display of unity. It would be an extraordinary move, but then again, little in these times was ordinary. Spring was a memory. Snow now dusted the rooftops in King's Landing on chill mornings, a rare sight in the Crownlands. People murmured that winter had come in earnest. The White Raven from the Citadel had not yet officially declared the new season, but the signs were there. The War of the Five Kings was over, replaced by a precarious tapestry of alliances under Joffrey's direction. In remote villages, small folk sometimes prayed for the old lion, Tywin, to return from the grave if only to bring clarity to the realm. But that was impossible. House Lannister's future lay in the hands of a boy who had become a man through bloodshed and cunning, forging an alliance with the wolf in the north. And in the farthest north, beyond even the wildlings, pale shapes glided through silent forests of ice, ancient powers stirring. They cared nothing for kings or alliances. Should they march, every ambition in the south might wither before the true face of death and winter. Yet, ironically, the realm's best chance lay in the very alliance no one had expected. The king who had shattered Tywin's hold and the king in the north who had once sworn vengeance. Together or not at all. Thus Westeros stood on the threshold of a new era. The War of the Five Kings had ended in a betrayal that reshaped the entire land, leading to a fragile peace perched atop more potential catastrophes than the Seven Kingdoms had faced in centuries. Wolves prowled the far north. A lion stag reigned in the south, tempered by Tyrell roses. The Vale lurked behind its mountains, Dorne behind its deserts. The Ironborn prowled the seas. And in the shadows the others advanced, if the old stories held truth. The next storm might dwarf all previous conflicts. Yet for a time, at least, the realm had quieted, forging alliances that no bard would ever have believed a few short years ago. In the Red Keep's throne room, Joffrey Baratheon, still young, though no longer a child, held court. A crossbow rested by the dais, a symbol that only the foolish would discount the king's capacity for swift and lethal action. Overhead, the banners of House Baratheon and House Tyrell fluttered in a breeze from the window, while the gold Lannister lions perched in the corners, reminders of the legacy he had usurped by force. Each petitioner who bent the knee saw a king shaped by cruelty and cunning, but also by the necessity of holding a realm together. They could hate him, fear him, or respect him. He did not care so long as they obeyed. Beyond the Trident, beyond Moat Cailin, beyond the seas, 1,000 possibilities loomed. War, peace, betrayal, alliances. No man could say which would come first. But if the watchers from the towers at Castle Black were to be believed, an ancient terror was stirring that might sweep away kings and petty rivalries alike. Joffrey and Robb had, in their twisted arrangement, seized hold of the realm and paused a brutal civil war. But they might soon find themselves mere mortals standing before a storm that mocked mortal crowns. For now, though, the boy king pressed on, delivering judgments, punishing defiance, balancing alliances like a juggler with knives. He had walked one path to seize control, allying with his mortal enemy to kill his own grandfather, forever earning the name Kinslayer. In the minds of many, that was an unforgivable sin. Yet, in the landscape of a war-torn kingdom, it had succeeded in forging a version of peace. Whether that peace would endure, or whether it was but a herald for a greater darkness, remained the question that haunted every corner of the Seven Kingdoms. Such was the shape of Westeros at the cusp of winter under a king who had learned that crowns are kept not by mere cruelty, but by cunning alliances, strategic mercy, and the willingness to slay whomever must be slain. The roads were open again, the fields sown with new seed, the gates of kings' landing bustled with commerce. And in the north, a black line of watchfires glowed on the wall, awaiting the next wave of invaders, be they living or dead. Robb Stark waited as well, torn between the tasks of warding off Balon Greyjoy and the vow to defend his land from nightmares he barely believed. The realm remembered the War of the Five Kings as a blood-soaked chaos that ended, oddly, with a crossbow bolt in a lion's chest and an accord no one could have predicted. Bards sang cautionary ballads about how the lion devoured itself while the wolf prowled at the door. But the more perceptive voices recognized the outcome as a testament to how fragile mortal power truly was. A single night of cunning, a single betrayal, had undone the mightiest man in Westeros and reshaped the lines of loyalty for a generation. Over time, small folk and lords alike would tell tales of that fateful union between King Joffrey Baratheon and Robb Stark, the king in the north, each claiming it was an alliance forged in the gods' own forge or a cursed compact that would one day drench the land in fresh carnage. In the end, the truth might lie somewhere in between. For in Westeros, peace rarely lasts beyond the next ambition, the next hunger for vengeance. And while the War of the Five Kings had cooled, the realm's next trial gathered like storm clouds beyond the horizon. A reminder that in the Game of Thrones, no victory is ever final, no alliance unbreakable, and winter comes for all, whether crowned or common. So the roads wound on, and the days turned shorter, the nights darker. King Joffrey tightened his grip on the Iron Throne, while King Robb of the North manned the wall against threats unseen in centuries, and the watchers from the west to the east prayed that this fragile new order might endure long enough to outlast the biting chill of the coming winter. For in the quiet of darkest midnight, across fields of ice and forests of evergreen, a faint wind carried the sound of distant howls, wolves and something else, something colder than death itself. And perhaps, in that distant hush, the fates of kings were already sealed.